The truck arrived on a flatbed with its windows filmed in dust and its paint the color of old chewing gum. The tow driver signed the transfer slip like he was handing off a feral animal and asked if she needed help rolling it into the bay. She told him she had it. Leona Hargrave, 32, grease under her nails like a second set of fingerprints, stood with her hands on her hips and listened to the engine's cooling clicks echo inside the cinderblock shop. On paper, it was a surplus utility hauler from a shuttered quarry, auctioned for pennies and bought on a dare. In her chest, it was a puzzle with a heartbeat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. She'd been a mechanic since long before she called herself one. The first time she rebuilt a carburetor, she did it on a kitchen table while a thunderstorm crawled across the plains and her mother slept in a recliner with an ice pack on her jaw. Leona learned early that machines told the truth if you listened to them without insisting on your own story. People lied on purpose or by habit or because they needed to see themselves as better than they were. Machines had no such vanity. They just broke, and if you were patient, they told you where. She walked a slow orbit around the truck. Civilian bones, military posture. Someone had peeled off a name stencil on the driver door with a razor blade and too much pressure, leaving a ghost of letters that refused to let go of the paint. The cargo box was longer than the frame chart said it should be, and the rear bumper had a fresh weld seam that tried too hard to be humble. A lie, Leona thought, squatting to sight down the latter frame. Every lie a machine tells leaves a shadow. Her shop was the last light on a street of dark windows, pawn shop, tire place, a locksmith who never seemed to open before noon. The hours stretched thin. The radio murmured a late-night host talking about meteors and the good kind of loneliness. Leona set a tripod work lamp to one side of the bay, rolled her creeper beneath the truck, and breathed in the familiar perfume of oxidized steel, old oil, and dust that tasted like pennies. She traced the wiring harness like a map reader fingers a river. The loom had been unwrapped and retaped by someone who believed neatness could pass for innocence. It never did. Neatness was just another mask. She found a junction that didn't belong, crimped connectors with numbers stamped in a font she associated with procurement offices and federal receipts, not the quarry's cheap improvisations, not the thrift of a private owner. Back out into the air and the light. She opened the hood. The engine bay was cleaner than anything else about the truck, too clean, like a staged photograph of a kitchen with no salt on the stove. She ran a gloved thumb along the fuel rail and came away with nothing. Someone had wiped it down with purpose. She leaned in, close enough that her shoulder brushed the support strut, and watched how the hoses talked to one another. A new fuel filter, a new belt, old coolant. The radiator cap had been replaced in the past 6 months by someone who bought parts in bulk and kept tidy shelves. Government tidy. "Where'd you come from?" she asked, a habit she knew was silly and kept anyway. Talking to machines felt like talking to the river when you crossed a bridge. You didn't expect the river to answer, but you respected it for being there. The transfer papers said the truck had been part of a quarry's support fleet until the quarry went belly up. The auction listing notes were curt. Non-runner, no keys, as is. A friend at the county salvage yard had texted her a winking face and a link at 3 in the morning. You love lost Alizes. The price was low enough to make suspicion a line item. She clicked buy. Keys were the easy part. She pulled the ignition cylinder and read the code, cut a blank with the little machine she kept for emergencies and curious midnights, and felt the notches smooth under her thumb like a familiar song. She climbed into the driver's seat. The springs complained without apology. She slipped the key in and wiggled the wheel, and let herself go very still before turning anything. Her father used to say, "Measure twice, bleed once." She didn't have a father anymore, and hadn't had one for long enough that the word felt like a tool she'd inherited without the instructions. But the saying remained, stubborn as rust. She turned the key to accessory. The cluster woke like a reluctant insomniac. The battery icon glowed steady.
The fuel gauge climbed, then stopped at 3/4. That wasn't right. A truck that had sat this long should have read low or lied in the other direction. She turned the key further. The starter clacked, then bit. The engine turned over with a grumpy integrity that made her smile despite herself. On the second try, it caught. The idle settled into a low, untrustworthy murmur. The whole truck shivered. The smell changed. Not just gas and oil. The faint sharpness of solvent and something else, dry and a little sweet like old fireworks paper. Not sulfur, not ozone. Memories crawled up her spine uninvited. 4th of July in a town that pretended to be bigger than it was. The sound of rockets thumping the ribs of the night. Her mother's hand on her shoulder. The smell wasn't the smell of celebration. It was the smell that lived behind the celebration, like the shadow of a grin. Leona shut the engine off and listened to the silence expand. Outside, a car hissed past on wet asphalt. The world continued being itself. Inside the bay, the truck settled with a long sigh. The cargo box doors were locked with a bar that had been painted to match the body. Stylish for a quarry, she retrieved bolt cutters and a pry bar, and the kind of stubborn patience that outlasts better judgment. The first lock snapped. The second fought, bent, and lost. She rolled the bar aside and eased the doors open. Darkness inside. Not emptiness. Darkness with texture. She swept the work lamp up, and the light moved across shelves that didn't belong in any quarry truck she'd ever worked on. Steel crates with stenciled numbers. Pelican cases stacked with careful malice. A roll cage welded to the box's internal ribs as if someone expected both velocity and trouble. The air inside was colder than the air outside, the way basements hold secrets at their own temperature. Her chest pulled tight, not with fear exactly, but with a focused animal attention. "You know this," something wordless said. "You know this shape." She stepped up into the box. The plywood floor flexed under her boots. She rested a palm on the nearest crate. The stencil wasn't the quarry's font. It wasn't anyone's casual font. It was a font that pretended not to care who read it because it assumed the reader knew better. She read the numbers and letters aloud because it steadied her. On the third crate, beneath a layer of dust that had been arranged rather than accumulated, she found a sticker half torn away. U.S. property. She exhaled through her nose. "Nope," she said, but her hands were already unbuckling the webbing straps. Curiosity was her oldest sin and her most loyal friend. The lid was held by 4 cam locks. They turned without complaint. Inside, dry packs, foam, and shapes that named themselves before her fingers finished the inventory. Magazines, wrapped bundles of 5.56 on stripper clips, a field armorer's kit with tools still zip-tied like an untouched Christmas, night vision goggles that were not hobby store toys, all oiled and preserved like someone expected to need it and got interrupted by a hurricane or a knock at the wrong door. Leona sat back on her heels and let her breath climb and fall. The shop's old clock ticked like a shoe tapping tile in the next room. She looked at the door to the street. Closed, bolt thrown, glass painted over with the shop's name and an old phone number that didn't ring anymore. She looked at the big roll-up. Shut, chain looped around its handle because she trusted the chain more than the lock. She looked back at the crate. There was a time to pretend she didn't know what she knew. That time was not now. She took her phone out and hovered over the screen. The number she wanted wasn't in her contacts. She had it on a note card taped inside the cover of a manual under the counter, a number given to her by a woman who'd once brought in an SUV, a bull bar, a federal badge in a wallet she didn't flourish, and a laugh that sounded like she'd seen worse than she let anyone guess. "If you ever see something that smells like the wrong kind of government," the woman had said, "call this, not that." The that had been 911. The this had been a number with no area code she recognized. Leona put the phone down and went to fetch the note card. She told herself she was only looking. She told herself looking wasn't acting. She told herself she was the sort of person who made measured choices and didn't let other people's paranoia become her own. She found the note card exactly where she'd left it. The ink had bled a little from summer heat. She entered the number without adding it to contacts and pressed call.
It rang once, twice. A click, and then a voice that took her pulse in its hand without asking permission. Report. Not who is this? Report. She swallowed the urge to apologize for existing. My name is Leona Hargrave. I bought a surplus utility truck at auction. I'm a mechanic. It showed up tonight. The cargo box is full of gear. She looked down at the crate like the word might cling to her boots. It's not quarry gear. Location, the voice said. She gave it. Do not touch anything further. Do not leave. Can you secure the building? Leona looked at her doors, at the padlock she didn't love, at the roll-up in its chain. Yes, she said, which wasn't precisely true, but wasn't precisely false. How many items have you opened? 1 crate. Magazines, ammunition, optics. There are more. The shelves are... Someone installed them with attention to weight distribution. The suspension's been upgraded. The wiring harness is non-standard. It felt good to talk about things she knew. The voice didn't say good girl, but somehow managed to communicate approval without softness. Any devices, electronics that seem active. She closed her eyes and replayed the walkthrough in her head. No standby lights, no fans, no hum, but the fuel gauge reads 3/4. Someone's maintained it. There's a fresh weld on the rear bumper and a false floor feel to the cargo bed. The voice paused. Paper turned on the other end. Or maybe not paper. She imagined a space with no clocks and no windows. Agents are en route. Do not advertise your discovery. Do not share this number. If anyone arrives before we do not engage. How would I know it's you? She asked, surprising herself with a streak of defiance that sounded more like self-respect than suspicion. You won't, the voice said, not unkindly, but we will. The line went dead. Silence returned, heavier this time. She put the phone down and felt the small tremor of adrenaline shake her wrists. She told herself to breathe in numbers. 4 in, 4 hold, 6 out. And the numbers obeyed. She took a roll of blue tape and crossed the bay door, the man door, the stair to the loft office with big X's like emergency rooms use when they close a hallway. She didn't know who she was signaling to. Maybe herself. Back in the cargo box, she lifted a second crate's lid without completely opening it, the way you lift a lid to smell soup you have no intention of eating. Foam, cases, another layer of magazines. On the bottom, something that didn't match the rest. Sealed bags with printed checklists, each checklist laminated and clipped. She read the first line of the first list and felt the letters rearrange her spine. Demolitions kit light. The second, breaching mechanical. The third, medic tactical. Tourniquets hemostatic. Okay, she said. Okay. She put the lid back down and backed out of the box like she was leaving a cathedral. The shop smelled less like oil and more like a storm coming from far away, one of those wide storms you can see boiling over wheat an hour before it arrives. Headlights drifted along the street outside, too slow for a car just passing through. They paused by the pawn shop, moved on, paused by her door. She felt her scalp tighten. The headlights went out, then came back on as parking lights. Handsome little move. She cut the bay lights and stood inside the dark, the work lamp a bright island behind her in the cargo box, spilling light out the truck's open doors and turning her own shop into a stage. Boots on wet sidewalk. 1 set. 2. A knuckle tapped the glass of the man door. A voice, muffled. Hey, Leona, you still working? My cousin said you sometimes take late jobs. Got a battery light on. Friendly, with the particular friendliness of men who want you to underestimate the cost of saying yes.
She ran a quick triage inside her head. She could pretend not to be here, but they'd seen the light. She could open up and try to play it casual, but casual was a costume that never fit her right. She could call the number again. She didn't. Instead, she walked to the door and stood close without standing within reach. "We're closed," she said, and made her voice flat as a torque wrench. Come on, just need a jump. 2 minutes. I can pay cash." From the corner of her eyes, she saw movement, another shape peeling out of the darker dark along the wall, too close to the roll-up. She had the specific sensation of being a rabbit whose knowledge of traps was about to be field-tested. She stepped back from the glass and let them see the motion without letting them see her face.
"We're closed," she said again, and this time she let the word no stay in her throat like a stone. She reached up and flicked the deadbolt, loud enough that it could be mistaken for confidence. The shape by the roll-up paused. The parking lights across the street went dark. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She shouldn't have answered. She did. "Leona?" the voice said without greeting, and this voice she recognized. The federal woman with the bull bar. No softness now. "We are 3 minutes out. Do not open any doors. Do not move the truck. If anyone forces entry, get distance between you and the cargo box." "There are 2 outside," Leona said. "Maybe 3. They know I'm here." "We know," the woman said. "We're seeing what they do." A pause, and then quieter. "If you have to choose between defending the truck and living to talk to me, choose talking." The line went dead a second time. She tried to swallow and found her mouth empty of saliva. The work lamp hummed like a mosquito. The truck's engine ticked, cooling like a metronome for a song she did not know. The doorknob shivered as someone outside tried it without meaning to seem like they were trying. A polite test. A soft knock. "Hey, Leona." The first voice again, a hint of impatience in its friendliness. "We can see your light." She tilted the work lamp so the glare turned the cargo box into a brighter theater, and then slid along the bay's cinder block wall until she reached the fire extinguisher. It weighed like a promise. She unclipped it from its bracket. She was not brave. She was deliberate, which looked the same from far away. A scraping sound at the roll-up. A hook finding purchase. She pictured the chain like an old dog, loyal, a little arthritic, not eager to fight, but willing. The hook tugged. The chain thumped. Someone tried leverage and learned something about their own expectations. Leona set the extinguisher down beside the crate labeled Demolitions Kit, Light, and had a short and serious conversation with her own hands. "You will not open that," she told them. "You will not be the reason a room full of strangers gets to say your name in a tone that tastes like cautionary tale." A new sound. A phone vibrating against metal. Not her phone, not a ringtone. The crate on the lowest shelf to the left. She crouched, leaned, listened. The vibration came again, patient, unembarrassed. She slid the crate forward 2 inches, just enough to see the lip of a burner phone, wedged between foam and wood. The screen lit with a number that was just zeros, an impossible mouth. Another knock at the door, less polite. "Last chance," the friendly voice said, the friendliness gone like an exhausted mask. She answered the call. Static. Then a man's voice that moved like a blade under a coat. "You're early," he said. "We expected the handover at dawn." She looked at the door, at the roll-up, at the truck with its wrong shelves and its correct secrets. "You have the wrong shop," she said, and the lie left her mouth too clean. A chuckle, not warm. "Don't we all?" The line clicked, then stayed alive in a way that meant someone on the other end had decided to listen instead of speak. She heard faintly another engine on another street. She heard a voice give numbers that sounded like coordinates said sideways. She heard her own breath and hated its volume. Sirens far away, rising. The knock at the door turned to a shoulder. Wood creaked.
The chain on the roll-up groaned but did not fail. A high white light swept the shop's front windows from the street and then pinned the door like a nail through a moth. "FBI!" a voice shouted, not through the door, but from the street, amplified and practiced. "Hands where we can see them!" Leona's chest picked up a second beat. She put the phone down on the crate and raised her hands, even though no one could see her yet. She moved into the open space between the truck and the tool chest, lines of sight a geometry problem her body solved without permission. The roll-up shuddered under a new official hook. The man at the door swore and stepped back into the halo of the white light like a stagehand who'd wandered into a scene too early. "FBI," the voice repeated. "Shop occupant, step back from the door." Another voice, closer than it should have been, spoke at the seam of the roll-up where the chain held. "Negative on entry. The box is hot. We don't know what's wired." Leona's gaze fell to the crate where the burner phone still lay, screen black now, call still active. She could see just at the edge of the foam a hair-thin filament stretched across the gap. Not a tripwire for a lid, she hadn't moved the lid. Something else. The kind of something that made men in heavy vests respectfully use the word hot. The shop filled with the sound of people breathing who were trying not to make noise breathing. The white light moved. The friendly voice from the door became a blur in the wash. Hands up, face pinched into a shape called useless excuses. Red and blue light smeared itself across wet asphalt like a painter with two colors and one big feeling. In the space between one breath and the next, Leona felt the plywood under her knee flex by a fraction that did not belong to her. She looked down. The false floor she had suspected was no longer pretending not to be what it was. A seam opened by a hair, a click so soft it could have been imagined traveled up the bone of her shin. She did not move. The world built itself into a stack of small choices. The voice outside said again, "Hands where we can see them." The man who wanted to jump said nothing at all. The burner phone on the crate, forgotten by everyone but the part of the room that remembered everything, vibrated once in a short, almost polite insistence. Leona realized her knee was on a pressure plate. And then the lights went out.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. And then the lights went out. Black as a closed fist. Leona didn't dare move. Her knee remembered the click the way skin remembers a burn, pure, bright, complete. She locked every muscle she could lock without shaking and measured the world in breaths as narrow as keyways. Outside, voices flared, "Hold! Hold!" and beams of white cut through window paint in skewed rectangles. Someone's flashlight licked along the roll-up seam and cotton metal like frost. The truck's work lamp died with the rest of the shop, leaving only the street's emergency glare and a faint red ember from the radio's on LED that should have been impossible because the power was down. Red like a pinprick star, red like a promise. Pressure, Leona thought. The plate will be crude or clever. Crude is dumb weight. Clever is a whisper you only hear once. "Shop occupant!" The woman's voice, close now, floated through the door with a practiced calm that lived above panic. "Leona, it's Agent Kincaid. We've cut power at the pole. Do not shift your weight. Say copy if you can speak." "Copy," Leona said, and tasted pennies evaporated from adrenaline. A silence opened. 2 heartbeats. 3. "Pressure plate?" Kincaid asked. "It feels like it. False floor just ahead of the crate stack. Something flexed under my knee. I heard a micro switch. The plate might be spring-loaded. It might be a tilt." She hated how the words came out clinical. The tone kept her from climbing out of her own skin. "Copy. We're not making entry hard until EOD is tight. You're doing perfectly. I want you to breathe like a metronome. Slow is safe. Tell me if anything changes under you, even a hair." Leona closed her eyes, which was absurd in the darkness, but helped. The plywood pressed a tiny pattern into the skin just below her kneecap. A vibration tickled the sole of her left foot, the distant bass of a diesel idling. Somebody had the sense not to kill every engine. A different voice, the radio clipped to someone's vest, cracked softly. "Kincaid, we've got 2 in custody curbside, 1 phantom who peeled when we lit the door. Plate reader on a silver van says borrowed tags." "Copy," Kincaid murmured. "Set a halo. If the phantom calls a hello number, I want it captured." Then, louder for Leona, her tone flipping back to human, "You did exactly right calling us. That takes nerve. We're here because you are stubborn at the right times." Leona let out a breath small enough to fit through the eye of a needle. "I don't feel brave," she said. "Good," Kincaid said. "Brave people move." Time stretched until it was a rope she could pluck like a guitar string. Voices moved at the edge of the world. Gloved hands slid tools along the roll-up. Someone used a wedge and a mirror. Someone sprayed a mist through the door seam like fog that smelled faintly of green winter. A second later, a faintest green constellation bloomed where lasers met airborne particles. Nobody explained, and Leona was grateful because explanations filled the brain with pictures that wanted to pull her off the plate by curiosity alone. "Hargrave." The new voice was a baritone wrapped in cotton, EOD probably because it had the slow grammar of people who never twitch on purpose. "Name's Rios. We're going to come to you without touching your floor until we can see what your knee is telling us. I need you to talk like a level. Tell me if the bubble moves." "I'm a wrench, not a level," Leona whispered. "Tonight you're both," he said, and she almost laughed because somewhere in there was mercy. The first thing she saw clearly was the glow of a chem light bouncing off the truck's interior, then another, and then a face shield, low and sleek, ghosting between racks like a fish in a dark aquarium. He was lighter on his feet than his gear suggested. He placed soft weights along the plywood, the kind that spread load without asking the wood to lie. A thin mat, unrolled like a tongue of shadow. At the threshold to the cargo box, he stopped. "Visual," he said. "Kincaid, you seeing this?" "On your shoulder," Kincaid replied. Rios lowered his voice to the smallest acceptable sound. "Leona, I need you to describe exactly where your knee is relative to the left wheel well and the crate stack." She pictured the box as a diagram drawn in chalk. Third rib from the door, left side, just past the crate labeled Demolitions Kit Light. Half a hand's width off the seam I thought was fake. "It's not fake," Rios said, and Leona could hear the frown under his face shield. "It's a float. Someone made a floating floor on springs. Old school clever. Forces you to commit your weight to a defined zone." "Meaning?" Kincaid asked. "Meaning, if she shifts off, the float rises and something else happens. Could be a firing switch that wants to see open circuit before it closes the world. Could be a spring that slaps a striker. Could be nothing but scared her on purpose. But the wiring I can see from here is not theatrical." Leona's mouth went dry again. "Burner phone in the crate is live. Call still active." Rios went still in a way that felt like a different kind of motion. "Is the handset touching any wire?" "Negative. Foam pocket, but there's a hair-thin filament stretched across a gap near it." "All right," Rios said softly. "Think of this like a carb you don't want to flood. We're going to bleed your weight out of the system the way you bleed pressure off a line. Slow, steady, with loving disrespect for the person who plumbed it." He slid a wafer of black under her shin, then another. Each one took a whisper of her weight and gave it to the floor. He inflated something flat with a pump that sounded like a mouse trying not to squeak. Leona felt the knee ache change notes. In her ear, Kincaid talked about everything and nothing all at once. About how quiet the street had gotten, about the smell of wet asphalt after the first cold week, about a dog 2 blocks away who wanted everyone to know he had opinions. Leona understood the tactic and let the talk braid itself with her counting. 2 millimeters, Rios murmured. That's the first chew. Good. Don't chase it. Leona kept her breath the size of a postage stamp. The matte balloon lifted candle glow by candle glow. The float creaked in a language Leona didn't know but could pretend to. A hair pulled from her knee. Rios slid another wedge. When the last of her weight left the plate, the world didn't explode. That in itself felt like sacrilege. Rios's gloved fingers tapped her calf, a cue without tug. "Come back along your own path," he whispered. "Heels first, then shin. We don't honor that float by giving it any new stories." Leona moved 1 inch at a time until her knee stopped speaking the one note it had been singing. When she reached the threshold and felt proper steel underfoot, something unstrapped inside her ribcage. She set on the lip and let the shaking happen, because her body had collected the bill and was now insisting on being paid. Kincaid's hand materialized in the dark. Leona didn't take it. She let it float there, a lighthouse the boat could find or ignore. "You're good," Kincaid said. So quietly the sentence felt private. "You did it." Leona nodded because nodding required less dignity than tears. Rios didn't look up. "We're going to do the rude thing now," he said, and began to peel the truck like a fruit. Thin blade pry bars, a stethoscope glued to wood with a palm. A fiber optic wormed into the seam. He narrated for his team, for Kincaid, for the record that someone would assemble tomorrow. Spring-loaded float, 2 sets of limit switches, redundant logic, dead man filament across the crate stack. Phone appears to keep an open line to a monitoring handset. If the line drops, this circuit looks for a new truth. If it gets that truth, it tries to make a very big point. "A point that removes this block from the map?" Kincaid asked. "Maybe not the block, but the building would have opinions." "Leona." Kincaid's tone turned gentle. "I'm going to get you air. Step this way." Out on the sidewalk, the world felt too large and too bright. Red and blue skated over puddles. The 2 men they'd taken sat cuffed on the curb, cheeks bleached past anger. One looked at Leona with a hatred so pure it was almost relief, as if the universe finally had a face he could blame. She stared back until he flinched. It wasn't courage. It was fatigue. An agent draped a blanket over her shoulders because protocols need rituals. Leona let the fleece absorb the sweat she refused to see. Kincaid stood beside her, hip to hip, no crowding. "You saved some people tonight," the agent said. And Leona shook her head immediately, because saving people sounded like a word for larger, cleaner acts. "I called a number on a card. Rios saved me." Kincaid's smile was a flash of teeth that did not need to be pretty. "Rios is paid to show up. You are not." She tipped her chin toward the truck. "We'll clear that room like it's a confessional with a wire to God. Then I'm going to ask you some questions you won't love, and I'll answer some you will." Leona rewound the night like a belt on a pulley, and caught on a burr. "The phone," she said. "He called expecting a handover at dawn." "We heard. We also heard who he thought he was talking to. Part of a crew that's been trading fertilizer conversations and martyr podcasts like baseball cards. Your truck, and I'm going to call it your truck until legal says otherwise, was scheduled to be someone's present to a crowd that didn't ask for one. Your curiosity put a clock on our side." Something inside Leona recoiled, a combination of disgust and fury that felt like touching a live wire even from a distance. "They drove that thing around my town?" "Yes, and then they made the mistake of leaving it in front of a woman who can smell a fresh weld and the kind of tape a procurement officer likes." Back inside, Rios worked. He and his partner built a scaffold of caution around the float, cut the burner phone line while giving it a new lie to chew on, and fed the circuit a diet of volts that kept it too full to make bad decisions. Every time they moved, they paused to listen, a sacrament of competence. The first package came up from under the false floor like a fish pulled from a net. A steel box with rubber feet, and a panel someone had polished because fingerprints are a kind of confession. Rio set it on a table and let a camera do the touching. Later, when she got to see the photos, she'd learn more new words for old fear than she thought grammar allowed. For now, she understood only shapes. Batteries, a logic board not bought at a hobby store, a relay array, a hand-lettered note taped upside down inside the lid, left thumb, not right.
Hijacked utilities manual in the glove compartment, another agent reported. Tabs on water treatment, substation entry. Printed like a real person put thought into it. Maps? Kincaid asked. 2 sets, came the answer. Civilian, and one that looks like it was purchased at a store that doesn't advertise. The search widened. Under the shelves, more shelves. Behind the wheel well, a void stuffed with soft cases. A long helican labeled farm supplies that contained nothing even distantly related to farms. The list piled up: optics, magazines, medical kits, breaching tools, radios, plates, helmets, and in a cooler that wanted to be beer, blocks of plastic explosive wrapped like butter at a farmer's market for people who hated markets. Kincaid didn't exclaim. She nodded as if adding items to an internal grocery. Photograph, bag, tag. Nothing goes to evidence without a portrait and a story. What story do you want for butter that talks? Leona asked, finally feeling something like the world slide back together with glue that wasn't just adrenaline. The truth, Kincaid said. No adjectives until the nouns give up. We'll get the rest when the phones start to sing. As if on cue, somewhere on the curb, a confiscated handset chittered. An agent murmured, "Incoming to the hello. Same 0 number. English with a habit." "Put it on," Kincaid said. A speaker spat a voice across wet air. "Door is dark. Window 3. Careful for the present." The tone held the casual intimacy of people who had mistaken conspiracy for friendship. Kincaid's eyes didn't move from the truck. "We'll keep the line open. Don't scare him yet." To Leona, she added, "They teach each other in basements. They call it education, and it feels like belonging. Then they drive an arsenal down your street." Leona thought of the smell when she first cracked the doors. Old fireworks paper and a shadow of a grin. What happens to them? The 2 on the curb, the phantom, the voice. We arrest the ones we can prove, and we study the ones we can't until we can. Meanwhile, we pull every person who touched this truck out of the dream they're in and show them daylight until their eyes hurt. She touched Leona's elbow, light as a wire. We also make sure the town wakes up to a boring morning. It did not remain mooring. At 4:13, while Rios and his partner were lifting a second float panel with a device that looked like a spider deciding to fly, the phantom decided his pride was heavier than his fear. A figure peeled off a shadow across from the pawnbroker and moved along the awnings, patient, feet testing where water would tell on him. He made it to the locksmith's recessed alcove and drew something from the small of his back that wasn't a prayer. Leona saw him because she had the curse of seeing everything once she'd learned how. The blanket slid from her shoulders. Her voice came out steady because the part of her that fixed machines had jammed a shunt into the part that panicked. "Left, awning, by lock and key. He has a—" She didn't say the word. The word might pull like a magnet. Kincaid didn't turn. "I see him," she said. "Thank you." Into her radio. Green jacket alcove, left hand. Let him have the argument with himself 1 more second. If he resolves it wrong, resolve him. The figure made a choice. The choice made a sound. The sound made 3 agents move like they'd rehearsed this scene in a room with tape on the floor, and then in a room without tape, and then in their bones. The figure didn't get to learn how the scene ended because someone else did the learning for him. Silence returned with a different shape. The dog 2 blocks away refiled his complaint. Leona realized she was sitting on the curb and couldn't recall standing.
Kincaid inhaled once and exhaled the thought of the shape. "Back to work," she said, and the machine of competence hummed on. By dawn, the truck was skeletonized. Rios held up a shard of the logic he'd disarmed, a little daughter board soldered with care. "We've seen cousins," he told Kincaid, "but this one learned new tricks from someone who read a manual in another language and took notes." Kincaid nodded to the evidence folks and to a woman from a unit Leona didn't recognize who had the intelligence analyst's gift for looking like she lived 3 seconds ahead. "Tradecraft migrates like geese," the analyst said. "We knew a flock landed in the neighboring state. Looks like they wintered here, too." They photographed Leona's shop like it was a crime scene and a patient. Someone dusted the rear bumper weld. Someone else traced the wiring modifications in a notebook neat enough to pass inspection at a different kind of academy. Kincaid kept Leona in the loop without turning her into a spectator. It felt strangely like being on a pit crew for an event you didn't sign up to attend. When the sun reached the edge of the roofs, Kincaid finally guided Leona to the office loft and closed the door. The glass still wore the shop name in paint. The air smelled like ancient coffee and paper that had forgiven humidity many times. "Tell me everything from the auction listing to the second your knee found the plate," Kincaid said. "No flourishes. I'll interrupt you. That's love." Leona told it all. The ghost letters. The neatness that wasn't innocence. The smell behind the smell. The phone with zeros. The man at the door with a friendly that corroded quickly. Kincaid stopped her often to rewind a phrase and listen to its teeth. When Leona finished, the agent rested her knuckles against the desk like she could read grain. "You grew up fixing things that didn't know they were allowed to be fixed," Kincaid said, not a question. "My mother's car, and anything else that let me win arguments by listening better." Kincaid's mouth softened at the corners. "That skill set saved more than you tonight." She slid a form across the desk. "This says we borrowed your night and your courage. We're going to borrow your truck for a while, too. You'll get it back when the story starts teaching us new vocabulary." She signed, because the alternative was pretending she wanted to drive the thing again. She looked down at her hand after the pen left paper and saw a tremor she hadn't noticed. She closed her fist. "Do I go home? Do I sleep? Do I pretend this was a weird shift with overtime?" Kincaid considered. "You go somewhere you can hear a ceiling fan and feel stupid for crying when it turns. Then you let yourself cry. After that, you call me tomorrow and tell me you're still the kind of person who smells a fresh weld and calls instead of rationalizing." "Isn't rationalizing a civic sport?" Leona said. "Sure, for people who want to be spectators in their own town." They walked down to the street together. A dawn that had the color of old brass spored itself into the gutters. The 2 men from the curb were gone, replaced by chalk marks that meant someone else had a job later. The Phantom's alcove looked like a closed chapter. "What does he get?" Leona asked, nodding toward the memory of Green Jacket. "Consequences," Kincaid said. "Not because we love punishment, but because the alternative is letting gravity pretend it's a suggestion." She paused. "You'll get calls. Reporters. A cousin you haven't heard from in years who thinks you owe him the feeling of being near a story. I can put your number in a box. Say the word." Leona thought about silence as a tool. "Put it in a box," she said.
Kincaid did, in the way people like Kincaid do. Quietly, effectively, already done. For 2 days, Leona slept in increments and woke to new muscles she'd never met before inventing their aches. She washed the smell of old fireworks paper out of her hair and still caught it at the edge of memory like a song she couldn't place. She tried to work, oil changes, a brake job on a minivan whose owner apologized for the Cheerio sediment on the floor mats as if Leona were conducting a white glove inspection, and discovered that wrenches weigh different after your hand has signed a chain of custody. On the 3rd morning, the bell over the shop door rang and a woman stepped in wearing jeans and a t-shirt with the name of the defunct band and a badge on a lanyard that she tucked back inside her shirt like it embarrassed her. She had builder's hands and eyes that had spent a lot of time cataloging. Leona felt her guard rise and then be politely asked to relax. "Analyst Rowan," the woman said, offering a palm without insistence. "I like your torque charts." She nodded toward the wall where Leona had hung laminated graphs as if anyone besides her read them. "May I borrow your brain for an hour?" Leona shrugged. People keep taking it out for test drives anyway. They sat on milk crates, and the analyst unrolled a schematic across a fender. "Rios's team pulled this out of your truck. It's a control logic that talks to off-the-shelf phones and not off-the-shelf boards. We're pretty sure there's a second layer we haven't met. We've seen pieces before, but this is composed." She smiled at the word like it surprised her, then didn't apologize. "If you were going to hide another circuit where mechanics wouldn't immediately consent to look, where would you hide it?" Leona looked at the drawing until it grew topography. "Behind what already looks like the trick, the float steals attention. Behind the wheel well void if you were lazy. If you were clever, in the cab, under the dash, inside a harness that looks OEM." She tapped a rectangle. "Here. Everyone's hands go here, but no one believes this part needs suspicion because it's always messy." Rowan's smile sharpened. "Permission to bring in a mess?" They pulled the dash from a different truck the Bureau kept for practice, and Leona pointed at a junction block that existed to power things you never thought about until you smelled melting plastic. "There," she said. "That's where I'd hide a truth I only needed once." Rowan's team found a twin in the evidence box 2 hours later. The second layer's circuit nested in the harness like a lamprey. It didn't care about pressure plates or burner phones. It wanted a specific SMS with a string that looked random until you recognized the handwriting concealed inside. It would have armed a second device hidden in the driver's door cavity, and it would have been a very bad day for anyone who survived the first. Rowan came back that afternoon with coffee that tasted like whistleblows and gratitude that didn't try to perform itself. "You bought us time again," she said simply. Kincaid called that night. "We rolled up a storage unit an hour outside town," she said, dispensing with greeting like they were past needing one. "Your truck was headed to one of the righteous ones. We're making arrests with care. The voice on the phone will get his knock, might even be at dawn because the universe loves symmetry when it's feeling theatrical." Leona sat with her back against the kitchen cabinets and listened to her own pulse try to normalize. "What am I now? Witness? Nuisance? Footnote?" "Hargrave," Kincaid said, "you're the person who paid attention. The world runs on people like you who refuse to outsource their noticing." It didn't end with one unit and one knock. The crew had friends. Some were loud in comment sections and quiet in real life. Some were the reverse. Phones sung. Bank accounts inhaled and exhaled. A friendly garage 2 counties over had welded a false floor once and never thought to ask what it would hold. A retired machinist had milled plates because cash in envelopes makes old ethics feel negotiable. Kincaid's team moved like a tide that obeyed math rather than the moon.
Through it all, Leona refused to narrate herself as a hero because that word made tools slippery. She showed up when they asked her, once to identify a part number, once to translate a mechanic's shorthand in a notebook some kid had kept like a spellbook, once to testify to the difference between neatness and innocence. Each time she went home and set her palms flat on the wooden table and felt the certainty that metal offers when it lets you hold it accountable. 3 weeks after the night of the plate, Kincaid stood in the shop doorway at closing with a paper cup she'd stolen from the same coffee place that made gratitude taste like whistles. "We found the hand that wrote inside the lid," she said without prelude. "He taught in a garage that doubled as a dojo for bad ideas. He told kids that circuits make you clean because they force you to believe in consequences. Then he wired those circuits to people he didn't know so he wouldn't have to believe in theirs." She leaned her shoulder against the jamb. "He's in a room with no windows tonight." "And the voice?" Leona asked. "Doesn't like dawn," Kincaid said. "We introduced them." They stood in companionable quiet. Outside, normal evening noises tried to be brave around the knowledge that had been dragged into their neighborhood recently.
Somewhere across the street, the locksmith laughed at something only locksmiths find funny. "You ever get tired?" Leona asked. Kincaid considered. "I get tired of wading through the myth that monsters arrive with horns, but I don't get tired of nights when someone like you makes a decision that tilts the board." A customer's Corolla coughed to a stop at the curb, and Leona went to greet the woman who got out, shoulders high with the apology of someone interrupting something larger. Leona smiled a real smile and took the keys and promised to have it ready by noon. Ordinary transactions reasserted themselves like a heartbeat after a sprint. When midnight came, Leona turned off the shop lights one by one and stood in the bay with the quiet. The truck's space felt huge without it, like the absence of a tooth your tongue can't stop visiting. She had the thought, sudden and foolish, that she should buy a plant just to refuse the empty its victory. She laughed at herself and locked the door. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She considered letting it die. She answered. A breath on the line, then a voice that wore a different coat but carried an old blade underneath. "You cost us," it said, not angry so much as curious. "Why?" Leona looked at the dark glass and saw her own face, tired and not sorry. She said, "Because I fix things, and you are broken." The line clicked. No reply. The silence afterward was not empty. It was a space where a decision had been made and would travel according to its own physics. In the morning, Rowan sent a photo. The cooler of butter on a lab bench, each brick wearing a tag, each tag wearing a truth. Under it, one line, "You made the town boring." Leona framed the message with her thumb and forefinger and set it as her lock screen. Weeks slid into a shape that could pretend to be normal. The bureau finished with the truck, sanded fingerprints out of its narrative, gutted its floats, unwove its harnesses, turned it into a neutral noun. The impound lot called. "Ma'am, you can reclaim your vehicle." The man on the phone sounded like he'd been asked to hand back a knife that had once been in someone's ribs. Leona went with Kincaid. They signed for the husk. The two of them walked around it and didn't speak the eulogies they didn't believe in. Back at the shop, Leona put it in a bay and stared at it the way you look at a room someone used to occupy. She ordered a salvage title transfer to the feds and wrote one sentence on the line that asked why. Because sometimes empty is safer. At closing that night, Kincaid leaned on the counter. "You'll offer you money to tell it flashy. They'll offer you microphones and ratings and a way to turn your marrow into content. You can say no." Leona nodded. "I like boring," she said. Kincaid grinned. "Then you're my favorite kind of exciting." They locked up together. The street held its breath and then let it go. Somewhere a train 3 towns away blew a horn that made memory taste like citrus. Leona stood in the doorway a moment longer after Kincaid left, hands in her jacket pockets, and let her thoughts run like oil warming in a pan. Slow, necessary, ready to work. A breeze worried the shop sign, made the painted phone number look briefly new. She listened to the quiet. She told herself the same thing she told carburetors and people and nights that wanted to become stories. Keep telling the truth until something that was lying stops. Inside, the ceramic coffee mug she'd left by the drill press had gone cold. She drank it anyway and made a face and laughed at herself alone, which is one definition of healing they never write down on forms. The clock over the pegboard clicked once like a far-off camera. Leona flipped the last switch and stepped into the alley. Behind her, the shop settled, the boards in the loft answering gravity's questions with the confidence of wood that had seen worse storms and stayed put. In the near distance, police radio static burred and faded, other nights becoming other people's stories. Leona went home, slept with the window cracked to let in air that hadn't lived inside a bomb truck, and woke before her alarm to a dawn that looked like forgiveness wearing work boots.